Good afternoon. Welcome to a National Infrastructure Week panel being co-hosted by the American Association of Port Authorities and the U.S. Committee on the Marine Transportation System, or CMTS. We're going to be talking about today MTS resilience under climate change in a dynamic global supply chain. Very pleased to have four distinguished presenters with us today. We're going to talk about resilience of the marine transportation system, supply chain challenges, and a range of other issues. We're very pleased that we have two opening presenters with us today. They are Mr. Chris Connor and Rear Admiral Timmy. Chris Connor, as most of you probably know, is the president and CEO of the American Association of Port Authorities. And he was former global president and chief executive officer of Wallenius Wilhelmsen Logistics. It's one of the world's largest ocean car carriers and vehicle logistics groups. Mr. Connor has over 38 years of experience in international shipping and logistics. Rear Admiral Thomas is the Assistant Commandant for Prevention Policy at the U.S. Coast Guard and also the CMTS Coordinating Board Chair. In his position with Coast Guard, he is responsible for the development of national policies, standards, and programs promoting marine safety, security, and environmental stewardship. He has three directorates under him, which you're probably familiar with: inspections and compliance, marine transportation systems, and commercial regulations and standards. It's my pleasure to open with Chris Connor for some opening remarks. Thank you, sir.
Helen, thank you for that introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. Helen, kudos on the pronunciation of Wallenius Wilhelmsen, not one of the easiest names. You did that marvelously, so congrats on that. On behalf of AAPA, we're proud to be co-hosting this panel discussion as part of this year's United for Infrastructure Week. 2020 has certainly highlighted the high stakes and risk of disruption through a global pandemic and weather events, which have tested the limits of our nation's ports, critical infrastructure, and the overall marine transportation system. Conversations like today's discussions are important as we move toward the recovery of the nation. Together, we must ensure that all partners of our interconnected and interdependent supply chain have the resources needed to thrive. I want to say thank you to all our distinguished panelists for joining us today, and I look forward to hearing your insights regarding the marine supply chain, sustainability and environmental stewardship, intermodal connectivity, and keeping America's farmers, business owners, and manufacturers well connected to the global marketplace. Thanks also to our event co-hosts, Admiral Timney, Helen, and Mr. Chase Long with the U.S. Committee on the Marine Transportation System. Before I turn it over to Admiral Timney, I want to acknowledge, Admiral, the excellent leadership that you've shown during COVID-19. Thanks to your direction and flexible approach during a rapidly changing situation, maritime commerce was able to continue uninhibited and deliver the essential items needed to the front lines to combat this crisis. So with that, it's my honor to introduce Rear Admiral Richard Timney, U.S. Coast Guard Assistant Commandant for Prevention Policy and Coordinating Board Chair of the U.S. Committee of the Marine Transportation System. Admiral?
Chris, hey, thank you. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you for joining us here today and kicking us off. I can only second all the things you said. First, I will second my thanks to Helen and the committee staff who worked so hard to put these on, and as well as to the panelists who've given us their time today, and to all of you who are joining us. Boy, I looked around for examples to use for infrastructure, and I just didn't know which ones to pick. I mean, you want to talk about I-40 bridges with cracks in them and waterways underneath them that can't move any cargo now because of that shutdown. You want to talk about pipelines. You want to talk about the ability to shift liquid cargoes from the Gulf to the East Coast. That's been the last couple of days, and it just reinforces what we all know as professionals in the maritime transportation system, which is it's unbelievable value and it's really unknown status to so many. And so this conversation, as you mentioned, Chris, is tremendously important. We need to have it over and over and over again so that it resonates at those key times with policymakers and decision makers who are making investment priorities for the nation. And we have plenty to invest in our waterways. I've got my from where the Coast Guard sits, we've invested tremendous intellectual capital into our maritime commerce strategic outlook, which really is our strategic approach to how does this nation's MTS continue to function in the future. And our lines of efforts start with facilitating lawful commerce and trade. And the subset of that is the critical infrastructure that's involved in keeping that going. And so that's a partnership across the CMTS. I've been glad to work with the folks on this body for the last year and incorporate, again, that same priority into the work plan for the CMTS, as we have made it a priority under our 4 lines of effort to continue to highlight what the MTS brings to our nation. And it's just unbelievable to watch it play out in real time with the shortages that are really happening because of a pipeline issue. But the corollary conversation to that is, well, how come we can't bring it in by water? And that's a great conversation to have. There are reasons for it that have to do with where we've invested in our ports. And maybe it's an unrealistic place to bring it in some places, but I guarantee you there are places along our supply chain on the East Coast that would benefit from that infrastructure. And I hope to hear from everyone today. I look forward to this conversation. I thank everyone for coming together, and again, for Helen putting it together. I've got my standard talking point for the Maritime Commerce Strategic Outlook. It's 30 million jobs, it's $5 billion in economic impact, and it starts with those 361 ports around our nation and the waterways, both inland, coastal, and on international routes that keep us really in the lifestyle we're accustomed to. That means gas in our tanks, that means toilet paper on the shelves, that means exports to markets that keep our agriculture in the Midwest healthy and part of the heartland engine that drives the economy. So, Helen, with that, I turn it back to you for continued facilitation, and thanks for the opportunity to kick it off.
Thanks so much. And Admiral, thanks for your leadership. We're so grateful that you're going to stay on as coordinating board chair to finish out your term, even as you move down to District 8 to take over there. So we're so glad for that. Thank you so much. And Chris, I just want to thank you for making your bed today. It looks really nice. I did a really good job. Thank you. Very proud of you. I'm
so happy to welcome you all into my home.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. So today we have 4 panelists. Each one will do about 10 minutes, sharing what they do and their interactions with the marine transportation system and our global supply chain. I'm going to introduce each one of them, then go back and each one will do their 10 minutes, after which we will have a Q&A. So you see that there is a chat capability in this program, so please feel free to chat in your questions. I believe you can raise your hand. We'll do our best to call on you. And if we do, we really appreciate you introducing yourself, who you are, and the question. Although we would really prefer to use the chat function if we could. But please, even as the presenters are presenting, feel free to put your questions in so you don't forget them. Thank you so much. So with that, I am going to introduce our presenters, and then we'll begin. So our first presenter is Mr. Peter Friedman. He is the Executive Director of the Agriculture Transportation Coalition. He is very instrumental in developing U.S. and international transportation policy. You may not know that he was counsel for the U.S. Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation, and was responsible for drafting the Ocean Shipping Act, and has drafted numerous other transportation laws, including Jones Act amendments. Since leaving Capitol Hill, he has been a leading advocate for shipper and international trade interests before Congress, the Federal Maritime Commission, and other federal agencies. Secondly, today we have Mr. Darren Timothy. Darren is the chief economist for the U.S. Department of Transportation, a job he took in 2017. In this capacity, he leads the department's efforts to apply economic principles and methods and analysis of policies, programs, projects, and regulations produced by the department and its operating administrations. Thank you. Thirdly, we will have Ms. Kathy Vick. Kathy is the Chief Development and Government Affairs Officer for the Virginia Port Authority, where she oversees the Port of Virginia's government relations, community outreach, economic development, engineering, environmental services, and maritime incident response. Wow. Does anybody else have a job there? Because I think you're doing it all. Before accepting a role at the port, she served as Deputy Director for Energy Policy at the Virginia Department of Mines, Minerals, and Energy. Fourth today is Dr. Austin Becker. He's an associate professor in the Department of Marine Affairs at the University of Rhode Island. He's an interdisciplinary scientist. He works across the fields of planning, policy, engineering, and ocean science. We know him most for his work creating and testing tools that help decision makers engage with complex problems and consequences of natural hazards and large-scale shifts in climate and the resulting challenges in policy and planning. In 2020, he was appointed as visiting fellow at the U.S. Naval War College. So with that, we're going to go to Mr. Peter Friedman. The others, if you'd like to turn off your video camera, and I will do the same. And thank you, Peter. Thanks for joining us today.
Okay, here we go. Sorry about that. Now you can hear me, I presume. Thank you very much, Helen, for assembling this and for inviting the cargo. Too often when there's a discussion of infrastructure, whether it is ports or maritime or rail or surface transportation, the actual engine of infrastructure, that is the cargo, import, export, and domestic, is sort of left out. So Helen, thank you very much for encouraging really the entity or the purpose of having the infrastructure. The purpose is to move cargo. And so you have cargo representative here, and we appreciate that. Let me just say briefly, there's some things we can do. And when we talk about infrastructure, we're always talking about building things. And I think it's always been a mistake that we don't step back and say, do we need to? For example, we have the lowest truck weights allowable on our highways, the lowest in the developed world. We have to have 80,000 pounds gross vehicle weights on our trucks going across the country, while Canada allows 105,500. Mexico, of course, all of Europe, Western Europe, Germany and Holland and Sweden and every place goes 105,500 or more. So these are countries where they care about the roads, they care about safety. We limit ours to 80,000, which means that the Canadian can send 2 trucks to the ports while we have to send 3 trucks to carry the same load to our ports. And this increases congestion and then thus demand to build more lanes, more highways, more roads, and frankly, unnecessary if we would only look at our regulations and see what makes sense. So that's one of the first steps that is usually not taken when reviewing infrastructure needs, but should be. I want to thank the Coast Guard. I'm glad the Coast Guard was on. Sometimes they stand in the way of bad self-serving proposals, such as verified gross mass, which was imposed by some people with green eye shades at the ocean carriers without much familiarity with how ports work and how marine terminals work, certainly in this country. And the Coast Guard helped staunch that really silly and fortunately ill-fated idea. U.S. exporters are not now burdened by the verified gross mass proposal, which the Coast Guard said was unnecessary, and we appreciated the Coast Guard's intervention on that. It's benefited to hundreds of millions of dollars of benefit U.S. export competitiveness. The presidents, speaking of port infrastructure, the presidents of many of the major container carriers have been quoted recently as saying one of the major causes of all the congestion and delay at the West Coast ports and East Coast too, where we see a dozen, 2 dozen, sometimes as much as 3 dozen ships floating out there waiting to berth because there isn't enough capacity at our terminals to handle it as fast as they need to handle the loading and offloading, have said that the problem is that the U.S. ports, unlike other ports around the world, do not work 24/7. In fact, they do work 24/7, but not the gates. And so that's what they were referring to. So one of our chief questions is how can we get our gates working 24/7? This is something that the Agriculture Transportation Coalition is working on, because right now our port capacity is insufficient to handle, as well as the ocean carrier capacity, insufficient to handle all the agriculture exports that we could be selling overseas, but cannot because there isn't capacity. And so with ocean carrier presidents putting that forward, we're going to follow up and are engaging with the longshore labor unions, with the terminal operators, Port Authority executives, and so forth, to see what it'll take, if it's possible, to move operate our gates 24/7. The ports have become a choke point. The ocean carriers have built huge ships. We're not against the huge ships unless they're too big for the marine terminals. And the marine terminals that were built for 7,000 TEU ships can't handle the 18, 20,000 TEU ships unless there are some of the ports with a little more real estate, a little more ability to increase their footprint to handle the big ships. And what we're seeing is in our international trade, we are in the moment where there's a shift of cargo, because what happens, you can have all the policymakers you want, but the cargo is like water and the ships will follow. The cargo and the ships are like water and they'll flow to the place of least resistance. And we're seeing the shift to other ports. And we have the Virginia ports on this webinar. I'm glad, Helen, you included Virginia ports, because that's been one of the beneficiaries, along with Savannah and Charleston, and Norfolk, of course, Virginia, for the additional flow of cargo to places where they have the capacity to handle the big ships. But there is a change of need, demand, and the flow of commerce, which impacts then all the interior points in this country where cargo that has gone west is now starting to go east, and that will add additional infrastructure demands, but also promises for more efficiency so we can move the cargo to international. And finally, I would say that continuing to say the cargo, international cargo moving to and from the United States, the number of emptied containers loaded, is greater than last year, is not the way business works. The question is, does it meet current demand? Does the infrastructure and the services, do they meet current demand for export and import? And if you talk to anybody at Amazon or Home Depot or Lowe's on the import side, or any agriculture and farm, the almonds, the cotton, you know, and soybeans and so forth, they will all tell you, import and export, that capacity does not meet the demand, does not serve the demand. The capacity isn't there at the ports and at the ocean carriers to meet the current demand for much greater volumes of imports, much greater volume of exports that are currently being carried. So a lot of challenges, but also some opportunities, some promises that we appreciate. And thank you very much. And we appreciate the partnership, of course, with the port authorities and very much with the Port of Virginia. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter. Next up will be Mr. Darren Timothy, who is the Chief Economist with the Department of Transportation. Darren, if you would like to put your video on, and Peter, if you'd like to turn yours off, please feel free.
Well, thank you, Helen, and thank all of you for joining us today. This, as Admiral Timmy mentioned earlier, this last year has probably brought more attention to supply chain resiliency issues than any time I can personally remember in my lifetime. That it's something that's both at the federal policy level, but also among your average American, average consumer, becoming more aware of just how it is that products that they need actually get to them. And this week, perfect example, I was planning to get my daughter to the airport, and she was going to drive up from college, and I never would have expected that we'd have to make alternate arrangements because she wouldn't be able to buy gasoline to make the trip. As part of this focus on supply chains, as many of you are aware, the President has issued an executive order directing federal agencies to produce a series of reports on some of our nation's critical supply chains. There are 4 reports focused on specific products, including advanced batteries and semiconductors that will be due next month. And he also directed 6 assessments due in a year from other federal agencies. And one of those was the reports our department is responsible for on the transportation industrial base. And so we're looking at right now how to scope that report as we start thinking about the transportational industrial base and everything that involves, both on the vessel and vehicle side, to the infrastructure side, all the things that go into making our transportation system what it is. It becomes an awfully big task to take on. So we're looking at how to best meet the intent of the executive order, which is to really look at these at this both from a national security lens as well as a national economic competitiveness lens. We also recognize that the kind of the flip side of this is the critical role that transportation plays in assuring the efficient movement of goods and services to support supply chains across the entire economy. We're making sure we'll actually be working with some of our fellow agencies to support them in development of their reports, and also looking to bring that into our report. We will be issuing a request for information in the near future. The required elements of these reports are quite detailed, and so we'll really be looking to industry to tell us what are the critical issues that you see. What affects resiliency in supply chains to support our nation's industrial base, and what are some of the public policy recommendations that might come out of this, ways that the federal government can support the efficient movement of goods to support our nation's industries. We've also been monitoring the situation for port congestion, of course, as that's been a key topic in these first few months of the current administration. We've been meeting with many stakeholders who are involved in order to better understand the issues, and again, look for areas where DOT could proactively help in coordination with our federal partners. It's been interesting to talk to various stakeholders and kind of get their perspectives, and really an appreciation for just how complex it is, that how many different players there are who all both have their own perspectives, but also work together to actually make it all happen. So again, in ways that usually only tend to be noticed when something goes wrong. On the infrastructure side, of course, the president is very much focused on this. He's recently unveiled his American Jobs Plan. He's been meeting with members of Congress just this week, and even today, to talk about how to turn this proposal into a legislative reality. Proposal calls for significant increases in investment in our nation's infrastructure, including $620 billion over 8 years across our transportation systems, including both for areas with traditional federal involvement, such as highways, roads, and transit, as well as $17 billion for investing in our nation's coastal seaports, land ports of entry, and the inland waterway system, and also proposed a healthy ports program to mitigate the cumulative impacts of air pollution in neighborhoods near ports. Among our ongoing agency responsibilities, of course, we have several discretionary grant programs that are administered out of the Office of Secretary. These are multimodal programs that have, and we all of which have eligibility for port infrastructure improvements. We are currently reviewing applications for the INFRA program and anticipate making awards early this summer. We actually have 3 different notices of funding opportunity that are relevant, that are out there right now. We most recently issued the notice for the RAISE program, which is formerly known as BUILD. Before that, known as the TIGER program, our most broad-based, broadly eligible program, which has applications due in July. We had the notice for the Port Infrastructure Development Program administered by Maritime Administration. Also has an application deadline in late July. Again, that's obviously specifically focused on ports. And we also have the Transportation Demonstration Program, which was created in the FY 2022 Appropriations Act, which has the most general title, but probably the most specific eligibilities. Eligibility is limited to maritime port authorities with meet certain criteria in terms of having a terminal rail line and being in close proximity to former military airfields. And with and that has 100 million in funding that would be specific for freight improvements. So there's really a lot going on. We certainly, my office is heavily involved in reviewing those applications. Some of the programs all require applicants to submit benefit cost analyses, which we review to determine whether projects meet the cost effectiveness standards set in the statutes. And I'm happy to answer any questions you all might have about that. Helen, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you so much, Darren. Really appreciate it. Our next presenter is Kathy Vick. There we go. I think we see you, Kathy.
Now I'm on mute. Sorry. First, I was having trouble getting my camera on, and we even tested this beforehand. So
Nothing's easy, Kathy. Thank you.
I know. Thank you, Helen. Well, I noted earlier when we were commenting on how beautifully Chris Connor makes his bed, that when I got the invitation to this, it said it's living room style, which if you go to a conference, it's typically the four of us sitting in armchairs, very relaxed. You know, since COVID, we're literally in our living rooms and our bedrooms. So thank you all for accommodating that. And hopefully you all are somewhere comfortable as well. I want to touch on a couple of things that the first two panelists talked about. And Peter, we appreciate the ag business that comes through the Port of Virginia very much. As you know, we've got a couple of transload facilities, and really want to look at how we do support that cargo owner. As Peter mentioned, at the Port of Virginia, we've been able to see a shift of cargo, both from the West Coast and some of the other more challenged ports with some of these import surges. And that's because we did a great deal of planning over the last several years and infrastructure improvements. We have 4 main terminals in the Hampton Roads or Norfolk area of Virginia, and then we have 2 inland terminals, one to which we run a barge service 4 days a week, and then one that we run a rail service to, 1 import train, 1 export train every day. So in addition to that, I know, Peter, you'd like us to be open 24/7, but at the Port of Virginia, we have implemented technology that allows us to groom the stacks 24/7. So even when our gates are closed, we're moving the containers and preparing them in conjunction with our truck reservation system so that they're in the prime spot for pickup when the cargo owner comes to pick it up. And what that's done for us is, you know, there's an industry standard, which is often, unfortunately, not met, of 60 minutes for a turn time for a truck to come in and get out of the facility. And we've been able to reduce ours to 36 minutes. So the average truck that comes into our facility to pick up cargo is out within 36 minutes and on its way to where the cargo ultimately needs to go. Also on our rail dwell, because of infrastructure improvements and new technologies that we've implemented, we've been able to increase, or I should probably say reduce, our rail dwell time to under 36 hours. So from the time the cargo comes off the vessel to getting on rail and out to Ohio, Kentucky, Chicago, Illinois, you know, all of these inland markets, we've really become a gateway for the Midwest portion of the United States. Now, we would not have been able to do that without significant federal infrastructure funding for that rail network 10, 12 years ago. So it all sort of plays on each other. And we were fortunate enough to be able to fund $800 million worth of infrastructure improvements on our terminals. That includes new ship-to-shore cranes that are the tallest in North America, that new technology, the rail-mounted gantry cranes that I was speaking about that are able to groom the stacks at all times, the truck reservation system. We doubled our rail capacity at our Virginia International Gateway facility, and now we're about to do the same at our Norfolk International Terminal. And this was all in anticipation of these ultra-large container vessels that we're now seeing, because the fluidity on the terminal is very important to the cargo owner. But there's really two other components, and Admiral Timmy really talked about this, right? It's the waterways. So we're also right now working with the Army Corps to deepen our channels to 55 feet and to widen them so that we have two-way traffic, not just with our commercial vessels, but we are the next door neighbor to the Norfolk Naval Base, which is the largest naval base in the world. So we need to make sure that we're coordinating that compatibility as well. And then it's that inland network. And so, you know, looking at some of the administration's focus on infrastructure, that inland network, both the road and rail networks that support the ports, it doesn't matter how fast we can move it across our terminal if there's a bottleneck at the other end. And so we stay very engaged with our regional metropolitan planning organizations or transportation planning organizations with our two inland ports and our main four. We're actually in 3 different MPOs. So we stay engaged with all of them to help advocate for funding. And so one of the things that we'd really like to see moving forward with these infrastructure investments is more of a focus on distribution to some of these regional transportation entities. Sometimes when they funnel to the state, freight is not necessarily at the forefront. There are a lot of other passenger congestion or passenger transit and things like that. So if there could be some dedicated freight funding to go to some of these regional transportation planning organizations in which ports service the immediate area, I think that could really help with the flow of cargo moving forward. And also, you know, with some of the earmarks coming back into play, allowing significant enough funding for each project to really move the ball forward. I know some of the projects that we submitted from our region, and this is for outside the gate transportation projects, we were told, oh, that's too much money. So really, we had to scale it back to only fund a certain level of design or some planning. And so I think if we're really going to move the ball forward with some of these federal investments, there needs to be a national prioritization of freight corridors and some dedicated funding for that. So, you know, we've been very, I would say, bullish about leveraging state and federal funds. We've had multiple, we had a Tiger grant, we had a Bill grant, and now hopefully we'll get a Raise grant. You can keep changing the name. We're still going to ask you for your money. We just received a PID grant that's going to allow us to double our rail capacity at our Norfolk International Terminal and do the same thing that we did over at Virginia International Gateway. And so we have 1 million containers of new capacity. And to Peter's point, that's why we're seeing a big shift to cargo. Opportunity to be here with so many distinguished guests with a lot of different perspectives and folks who've been great partners to us and will continue to be, and happy to answer any questions. Thanks so much.
Great, thank you so much, Kathy. Just to remind our folks that are listening in, please feel free to begin chatting in questions should you have them. It's my pleasure now to introduce Dr. Austin Becker. And Austin, you have some slides to share. So glad you could join us.
I do indeed. Thanks very much. It looks like I don't have the sharing option at this point.
Yep, if he could be given the option to share.
Okay.
All right, thank you
Great.
so much.
Terrific. Well, thank you so much for having me. It's a real honor to talk to this group. I'm going to share a little bit of a different perspective from the academic side of things. I've been researching ports and port resilience for the last 15 years or so, trying to kind of tease apart a really complex problem, especially with regards to long-term planning for port resilience. And I'd like to start from the premise that, the coastal infrastructure is critical, it's complex and constrained, and that makes planning very difficult. Of course, we all know that ports are economic engines at every scale, from the local providing jobs to the global, with 90% of products being shipped by sea. They're very complex. There's a lot of stakeholders involved, both geographically speaking, shippers and tenants and pilots and the like, and also complex across time, because port infrastructure is designed to last much longer than other types of structures, often 50 or 75 years or even more than that. And ports, of course, are constrained to these very specific locations where they need access to deep water, they need some protection from the elements, and they're often in estuaries, which are very environmentally sensitive areas. So we've got, the bulk of our world's product moving across our most sensitive habitat areas. So this makes planning quite complex and quite challenging for ports, especially when it comes to climate change. Ports, of course, are already at risk. This map just shows about a third of the world's ports that are within 100 kilometers of a tropical storm track over this 50-year period. And when we bring climate change into the equation, things get even more complicated. And for ports and for coastal infrastructure, there's really three main drivers that are of concern from a climate change perspective. The first is the potential of a doubling of the worst of the tropical storm. So not more storms overall, but more of the really big Cat 4 and Cat 5 storms by the end of the century. The second, of course, is sea level rise, and the sea level rise projections range from 3/4 of a meter to 2 meters, or perhaps even more than that by 2100. And then the last is increased heavy precipitation events. And so when we kind of roll these together, as some researchers have done, we find that what is today the 1% annual probability event, or the 1 in 100-year storm event, could be as common as the annual storm event or the annual flooding event by 2100. So this is really significant environmental changes that we need to anticipate in the coming decades. And for coastal infrastructure and for ports, the impacts of these kinds of events are not limited to just the direct damages that happen on port facilities themselves. So this is a picture from Gulfport after Hurricane Katrina of a refrigerated warehouse. This is the direct damage that occurred with a storm surge right on the port. But this kind of damage also leads to indirect costs, so lost wages, business interruptions, cleanup costs, etc. And importantly, it also leads to these intangible consequences that are really hard to measure, but impacts to quality of life in a city, for example, environmental damages, and the like. And we see this example also from Hurricane Katrina in Gulfport, where meat from this refrigerated warehouse at the Port of Gulfport was brought with a storm surge up to 3 miles inland. It was a 28-foot storm surge there, and it was very difficult to clean this up. And so it rotted in the neighborhoods, and 8 months later, the neighborhoods were still suffering from the smell and the contamination from this. So very complicated problems, not limited to just the port itself, but really kind of distribute across the whole community and the different stakeholders of a port. So this is not a brand new issue. Ports have been thinking about this for many years, and this is just some results from where we were 10 years ago. This is from a global survey of both the AAPA and the International Association of Ports and Harbors, where we asked port administrators, what were the issues with climate change that they were thinking about, and how were they considering adaptation. And at that time, 10 years ago, there was widespread agreement that climate adaptation was something that really needed to be addressed by the ports community. However, at that time, there was not a lot being done. So the results here show a few different options for climate adaptation that folks may have been doing at their ports. And there's, for the most part, ports really hadn't started to address this issue head on. And there's a lot of reasons for that. There's a lot of reasons that port authorities and port operators have not invested heavily in new resilience measures. And this is just a radar plot from some work that we did in the North Atlantic coast, where we asked port administrators why they hadn't yet done more to increase the resilience of the port. And there were a whole range of answers to this question, and these can inform capacity building activities that, for example, government agencies might want to support. So, for example, the problem is simply overwhelming. There's not a good understanding of how much risk there actually is. So we need more information in order to run better risk models. Or, of course, this was a big one, we simply don't have enough money. So this kind of gives us some indications of what we can do to try to help some of these decision makers overcome these barriers. And there are, in fact, a lot of things that can be done to build resilience. This is work from another study that just identified specific strategies that can be done that can be implemented in order to build resilience, not just for a particular port, but for a port community or a coastal community. And there's 7 categories here of different strategies, and you can see within each category there's quite a few potential options for both the port and other members of that community or a supply chain even to implement. And I'm going to highlight 2 examples of concrete things that can be done in order to build resilience. The first is conducting a resilience assessment. And many ports, I know Port of Virginia has conducted more than one of these types of resilience assessments, and other ports have as well. And I just want to highlight that the Cyber and Infrastructure Security Agency, it's under DHS, and the Army Corps of Engineers have been collaborating with others, including members of the CMTS, to develop a resilience assessment guide that can help ports and other members of the maritime supply chain to conduct a resilience assessment or a vulnerability assessment for their facilities and for their part in the supply chain. And what we've found in some research that we've done of ports that have already done this is that there's a ton of benefits to conducting one of these resilience assessments. They don't just help you identify what the specific problems are at the port. Of course they do that, but they also improve the institutional capacity. They help people develop a nuanced understanding. They enhance social capital, and they can develop other resilience enhancement options. So they're a lot of work, but they're also a very worthwhile activity for the port and the stakeholder community. And second, I want to just highlight another tool that we've been developing. This is a way not so much for long-term planning, but to better handle emergency operations. We've developed this prototype tool for Rhode Island emergency management, but it could also be used for port applications. And what this tool does is it incorporates qualitative data, so concerns about storm impacts from specific facility managers at a port or in a state, and integrates those concerns with storm models so that as a storm comes up the coast, we can actually make some predictions, not just about how much flooding may occur, but what the results of that flooding or the consequences of that flooding might be. So here's an example from the cement ship unloader, and another from a terminal manager here of what certain amounts of flooding might do as a storm comes up the coast. So we're working on this in Rhode Island, both for emergency management purposes and also for long-term planning purposes at Naval Station Newport as part of a military installation resilience review. So I'm going to close there for my hopefully 10 minutes. I don't know if I was close to that or not. Hopefully I was. And I will stop sharing my screen here and turn it back over to Helen. Thank you, Helen.
Great. Thanks so much. Could all of our presenters put their video on, please, if they could? And I don't see any questions in the chat yet, but I do want to note that I believe attendees can submit questions to almost anybody. So I'm going to start the Q&A with some questions, but if you find that you're getting questions directly to you, we want to give you an opportunity to read them because we may not get all of them. And I'm so glad you could all join us. Thank you. And thanks, Admiral Timmy, because showing your picture means you might get some questions as well. He's nodding.
No worries, I'm ready.
Rock and roll. All right, thanks.
Material.
Thanks. So I'm going to start out to go back a little bit to the very brief conversation about port congestion or congestion in the transportation supply chain. Kind of just touched on it very briefly. Darren indicated that the department has been meeting with industry representatives to understand those challenges. I'm sure that you and we all recognize that many of the supply chain issues which lead to congestion are not necessarily something that the federal government can impact. My first question is to Peter. You've been actively engaged in challenges of moving U.S. grain for export. Could you briefly explain what these challenges have been and the ways in which you and your coalition are working to address them? Thanks.
Thank you. And I'd like to say, first of all, in talking about cargo shifting from West Coast to East Coast, and well, that makes Kathy happy to hear, and Virginia, forcing cargo to move from one area of the one series of gateways to another is not always the best solution. It's sometimes the best available, but for agriculture exports, the West Coast gateways remain critical because if you're in a hurry to get to our biggest markets, which are Korea, Japan, China, that is the direct route. And if you're sending chilled protein, beef and pork and so forth, it's really the only way you can go. You have to go through those West Coast gateways. You can freeze it and go through the East Coast. So we need all the gateways. We need all the coast, and that's absolutely critical. Nonetheless, Vicki, during this conversation, I just got a message from one of your largest agriculture exporters from Virginia, who's built a couple transload facilities at the Port of Virginia. You know who I'm talking about. It's one of the top 20 exporters out of the United States. And just then, some other issue. Now, there are things that ports could do, and I will give a shout out to Port of Virginia. I think Savannah and Charleston's done it. Nobody else has. But it shows where ports do not have to sit back and say, we're just the landlords and there's nothing we can do. Virginia ports have locked the ERD. When an ocean carrier changes schedule, which is happening all the time, ocean carriers are not on schedule most of the time. Once they have the earliest return date set, 9 days out, Virginia locks that. So even if the carrier is delayed, nobody's going to get charged additional demurrage because the carrier is delayed, which happens virtually everywhere else. Carrier loses schedule, and then they start charging hundreds and in some cases thousands of dollars on demurrage charges to the exporter for nothing of its own fault, and in fact declared unreasonable and illegal by the Federal Maritime Commission. But we thank Norfolk and Savannah and Charleston for actually looking after the cargo interest and locking those earliest return date. So there are things you could do. 36 minutes in and out for a trucker, you know, in other ports around the country, that's just dreaming. So, you know, that's a demonstration that there are solutions. Grain has moved from bulk to containers. Still, most of the grain, Helen, is moving by bulk in the large volume. But, you know, like every place else, if you want to ship quality, you need smaller quantity. And for soybeans, the grade A soybeans have to move by container. and that's why they're moving by container instead of bulk. You can't crush them. Same for other grains, the specialty grain, the GMO, the non-GMO. You know, as Asia increases in wealth, the consumers there increase in how picky they are and what they eat. We do not eat just bread. You don't go to a supermarket in this country and say, I'm just going to pick up bread. The question is it rye? Is it pumpernickel? Is it whole grain? You know, is it non? All these different questions we ask in Asia, they are asking that as well. And that's why the grains have to be segregated by quality, in quantities that are small enough that can support a pickier consumer, if you will. And that's why it's shifting. And that's why these transload facilities at Los Angeles, they're building 2 more in Southern California. Norfolk has a couple of them. Savannah and Charleston and Houston are building transload. So you get it out of these unit trains and get them transloaded into containers that can go on the container ships rather than the bulk ships.
But you're having no trouble then getting those containers out? Finding 20-footers and getting them out?
Lots and lots of trouble. There are not enough containers available. The ocean carriers are less likely. Helen, you are poking the bear there. You know it. The carriers prefer not to get $400 or $500 a container for outbound and tie up the container. They'd rather hustle that container empty back to Asia so they can get $14,000 of consumer goods, the clothing we're wearing and so forth, coming into this country. And they are stranding a lot of our, what we call lower value cargo. Now, here's the question. The cargo that we export from this country is lower value. We're not manufacturing footwear and apparel and consumer goods in this country. We're producing grains and soybeans, cotton and rice and lumber, and all the products that cannot really afford to pay much more than $500, $600 a container, unless you get to protein, and that's the highest, maybe $3,000 a container for refrigerated container. So the ocean carriers say, it's not worth our time to carry that, we'll go back empty, and that strands our exports. I would just suggest this for policymakers at Department of Transportation and elsewhere. In November, when the freight rates for import cargo coming into the United States was just going up through the roof, that's China's exports. And China has a maritime authority, but apparently it wasn't the whole maritime authority. It was just a couple people there, had a conversation with a couple carriers, European carriers, I would say. And they had a conversation, and the next day, guess what? Those 2 carriers announced, and the rest of the carriers followed, that the previously announced GRI was being rescinded. That's what happened. Now, we go through a different process at the Federal Maritime Commission. We have hearings and notice and all the rest, but that's what China does to protect its exporters, to assure that its exporters have the capacity. And frankly, that's, I believe, what the US needs to do. Follow China's lead, protect our exporters in an environment where national market forces are not necessarily helpful for our export competitiveness.
I'm sorry, I'm muted. Eeny, meeny, miny, mo. Sorry about that. Kathy, did you want to respond to Peter's comments about the front gauge or anything else?
Well, I did. I just wanted to say thank you, Peter, for recognizing the collaboration between the ports and the cargo owners. And I think we really need to see more of that, like with the ERD and the transload facilities that we've implemented. That's really about listening and not just looking at your terminal as a place where cargo comes, right? It's also we're the middleman, right, between where it came from and where it needs to go. And so looking for some of these innovative solutions to really help the cargo owner will allow all of us to improve the supply chain, and it helps us collaborate when requesting federal funds from some of these grants. So one of those transload facilities is at our Richmond Marine Terminal, which is that barge facility that I mentioned. Well, MARAD's been great about supporting that, not only originally designated as a marine highway and helping fund the initial barge, but then also gin sets so that we could put refrigerated cargo as well on that barge system. So that's, again, listening to your customer. We're doing it right now with our truck reservation system and some of our retail users to use blockchain to connect our truck reservation system with Waze. I don't know if you're familiar with that, if that's a nationwide thing, but so that their GPS tracking can show them the best route, the best time of day to make a reservation, some of those things. So it's really the continued collaboration will help us. And Darren, you'll be happy to know and I cannot remember all the names in this acronym, but it's the ATCMTD grant, the Advanced Technology Grant. So we use that grant to pilot that connectivity between our reservation system and the local Waze system.
Kathy, let me just say, and this is for AAPA, and there are lots of ports around this country where the executive directors have extreme envy of you and other operating ports, because virtually everything you just said can be done by an operating port, but cannot be done by the ports that are the landlord ports. Because that grant you were just talking about would be fabulous for Gene Soroka and what he's trying to do in LA and Long Beach, to have a portal for all the information to come in, the inefficiency that goes on there, because frankly, the Port Authority is not an operating port, and they have to depend on these terminal operators and the ocean carriers who have different agendas than what a Port Authority does, which has a public obligation, which you are fulfilling, and other operating ports can fulfill. But that is one of the things that I believe would be the most difficult to achieve, but the most beneficial to convert more of our gateway ports to the operating port model so they can accomplish what you all are doing.
I think we should make a note of that for sure, because that's, to be honest, first time I've heard that notion, but I get what you're going. I got a question for Darren. Darren, you talked about the request for information. Could you tell us when you think it might be issued? And I know it's premature, but you possibly give us a little bit about the areas in which you're going to be seeking comments?
So we hope to have it out probably in the next month or so. A lot of the focus in this larger government-wide effort has been on getting these 100-day reports through the process. As I mentioned, those are currently under review, and kind of using that experience as a guide. Some of the agencies such as Department of Commerce, Department of Defense, that had responsibilities for those reports did a similar effort and received comments. But a lot of the issues we'll be interested in are, in understanding, again, first we have to decide internally which aspects of the transportation industrial base we think we can tackle within this 1 year time frame, which sounds like a long time until you start adding up all the activities that go into producing that report. But looking to understand, again, thinking about some of the transportation and vehicles, vessels, and equipment side. What are the kind of critical products, critical inputs in their supply chains? There'll be this is an area that often can be. Oftentimes there's reluctance on the part of manufacturers to share a lot of detail. These are important aspects of their own competitiveness. But just understanding what the key inputs to their processes are, where they're procured from, where the potential hiccups are in that, which ones can be affected, are subject to influence by federal policy. There really is an interest in making this not just kind of a one-time effort, but something that is kind of almost like a quadrennial effort. It's been talk about that, doing that. That there's an ongoing effort to make sure we are at the federal level because we recognize that supply chains are evolving over time as well, and just understanding where those critical technologies, what are the things that would result in a production line having to be shut down, and how do these different relationships within the industry work. So
Thank you. As a follow-up to that, the CMTS brings together the federal maritime transportation agencies because there's a lot of them. And DOT, you talked about the industrial transportation base, which to me means the freight transportation base, and which to me means the entire transportation supply chain, of which maritime transportation is just one piece. How is DOT going to be really bringing that intermodal holistic concept to your view as you move forward, rather than mode by mode?
And that's where I think looking at the kind of transportation role in the, industrial supply chains more broadly will really come into play. And understanding this is something that last year under the previous administration we issued a national freight strategic plan, which looked at some of these different trends, and certainly intermodalism is it's with us, it's here to stay. And I think, as I mentioned, the stakeholder meetings we've been having regarding current situation of ports, there are just so many different pieces. So you have to understand perspectives from the shippers and the operators, from labor, but also from the trucking industry, from the railroads. How things are moving from one place to another. I mean, the more I learn about it, the more remarkable I sometimes find it that anything ever actually gets to me, given how many different hands it has to pass through. And I think that's a testament to sometimes it's easy to focus on the problems and kind of forget there really is this remarkable machine that we have in place that gets goods to market and inputs to producers.
Remarkable and complex, and there lies the rub. I love a charming question from somebody to Kathy Vick. Are you willing to share some of you said you put $800 million into your terminals, which seems like a phenomenal amount of money. And you indicated that you're going after the RAISE grants, as you should. We have a question, if someone asking if you might be willing to share a little bit of the kinds of things you might be applying for under the RAISE, or at least the areas in your port that of need.
Sorry, I was on mute. I can give you examples of previous projects that we've done. So we received $16 million for a $42 million project to extend our gates at Norfolk International Terminals. So we have a very large terminal that has both a north and a south side, and we only had gates on the south side of the terminal. So we were able to put in 26 lanes of gates on the north end of the terminal, which really helped with the flow of traffic. It took a lot of traffic off of local streets also, because our DOT, Virginia DOT, had done, well, we kind of did them simultaneously, a $225 million dedicated highway connector that it sort of went straight into our terminal and our new North Gate, and then the other one went straight into the Norfolk Naval Base. So it really helped with congestion in that area for both. So it was, and those are the types of projects in my experience that are the most competitive. Darren might want to comment on this, but they're like the final piece of a puzzle, right? When you can leverage investments that your state has made, or that the port itself is funding, and you can show that there's a gap, that this is sort of the final mile, right, of a bigger puzzle. It's also in an underserved community, so it helped that we were reducing emissions and congestions in an underserved community. And I think environmental justice is becoming more of a focus with the new administration. So I think that's another thing to look at when you're looking for projects is how does it not just help you and your customers, but how does it impact the communities around you? And then one of the things that we'll be applying for is to help with some of the infrastructure that we're dedicating to offshore wind. So again, that is something that is the new administration is really focused on is clean energy. And so doing our part to help facilitate bringing that industry to the United States. So that's another good one. The PID grant that we just received for the rail connectivity, again, it's should be a federal investment. It's about, I don't remember, maybe we're paying 55, they're paying 45, maybe we're a little bit more at the end of the day, but it's because it's a gateway into those Midwest states. And so I think the narrative was around how we're making the investment with dollars here in Virginia, but it's there's a return on that federal investment because of the rail connectivity that gives us to the Midwest. So those are just a few small examples. There's been others, and like I said, there'll be more. But we really try to, again, listen and partner with the local communities, with the federal and state folks and what their priorities are, and serve the same mission and show the return on investment by impacts to the community, jobs that can be created, and the commerce that it moves, not just for our state, but more broadly. Thank you for the question.
No, it sounds like you have it so in hand, you could actually teach a course on how to apply for those grants.
Then they would just compete better with me, Helen.
That's right. Yeah, there's that. And we should give a shout out to all of the economists at DOT who look at all of the benefit cost analyses in all of those applications, because that job is spread throughout the department. So kudos to all of you. Dr. Becker, I've got a real simple question. Are the ports getting more resilient?
Well, I think the ports are getting more resilient. We've looked at 10 ports that have done resilience plans in the last 10 or so years, and there's about 4 or 5 others that we identified that have gone through a process, but we were not able to go into detail on their experience there. But I also think, as ports are getting more resilient, the resilience challenges are also increasing. And I think that the smaller and the medium-sized ports have maybe a bigger challenge ahead of them, where the big ports, they're refreshing their infrastructure on a fairly regular basis anyway, and so they can incorporate these new climate projections along the way. But the smaller ports and the medium-sized ports, both in the U.S. and internationally, and especially in the developing world, they don't have the same resources to be making these continual improvements on their infrastructure. So yes, I think the culture around resilience has been changing, and it's being incorporated, and especially with the new administration, I think we'll see a big shift over the next few years of how resilience gets incorporated into the planning process. So I feel optimistic about that.
Thanks. And as a follow-up, and I think this is an unfair question. I actually thought my first one was a little unfair, but you did a great job of responding. Secondly, I realize that every hurricane, every storm is different, has different aspects to it that are more damaging than others. And of course, locations of ports make a difference. But is it your estimate that maybe sea level rise and sea change is perhaps one of the most concerning impacts that we may have in the future, or is it a mixed bag?
I think that sea level rise is going to make a significant contribution to how these big storms and nor'easters, at least on the eastern seaboard here, are impacting operations. But sea level rise alone is also going to be a huge problem. And I think that the next couple decades, we're probably okay from a sea level rise perspective in most places. Port of Virginia might beg to differ on that. I don't know. But I think the real challenge is that all of our coastal communities and all of our coastal ports are, in the next few decades, are going to be up against some real significant challenges with sea level rise and storms. And the demand for resources is going to be hard to meet. When every coastal community is starting to recognize that they need to armor themselves, or they need to relocate, or they need to take real significant actions to kind of get out of harm's way, I think there's going to be some difficult questions that are going to be posed, and that's going to be a hard process, especially on the federal level, to be making decisions about which ports are going to get resources to make significant resilience enhancements and which ports are not. Maybe not a problem for today, but certainly a problem in the near future.
Thank you. Many years ago, when we first started talking about this, someone once said that there's not enough concrete in the world to help, build this up and out. And it's a minor comment, but probably true. Chris, if you don't mind, I mean, you have so much experience in the business, and there is a shortage of semiconductors in the marketplace. And I don't know if you're watching this at all. I suspect, given your past experience, that you may be. And that shortage of semiconductors has had kind of an indirect, direct impact on the supply chain, and certainly the auto industry in particular. And as a result, there's less production right now. Are you watching this at all? Do you have any feeling on how this has impacted the car carriers, the rower ships, or the business out there in the supply chain?
Yes, we are watching it, and there's no question. I mean, that semiconductor chip shortage is affecting many industries and impacting their sale. You see used car sales now, for example, are exploding because you can't get new cars, and the prices of used cars are going up significantly because of it. So it's just one more example of what the pandemic has created in terms of disruptions to the supply chain. But since you brought me into the conversation, if you don't mind, I'd like to just make one observation. So I had a chance this past week to testify at the Senate Commerce Committee hearing. And as you could expect, the senators, many of them asked questions which I would say were on message in terms of the broader topic, which was freight mobility, but very specific to the area of the country that they come from and represent. And a lot of questions about congestion. And I couldn't help but think, and I answered one question, not exactly as it was asked to me, but I wanted to make sure that it was not lost on all the senators that there's a lot of contributing factors to this challenge that we're working our way through right now. But one of the biggest factors is the fact that we have underinvested in our port and maritime infrastructure for decades. And I think now's the moment. And at that table this week, both Republican and Democratic senators, and there seemed, to my eyes, not to be any big debate about the need for investment in our ports and in our intermodal connectors. So I would just say to the panel and to everybody in the audience, I think we should be shamelessly direct and clear about the dollar needs that we need. It's not to have the federal government pay for everything, but it's going to unlock private money. It's going to unlock state money, which is going to help us build out the freight movement network for perhaps the next 1 to 2 generations. So now's the moment. I think both sides of the aisle are saying the same thing, and we should be focused on what's best for the industry writ large. And then when the money's made available, of course, we can all battle like heck with one another, for that grant money based on the viability of the projects, which, Darren and his team will consider on their own merits. So thanks for the opportunity to be a politician and pivot for your question and answer how I wanted to.
Glad we could be of service. Thank you so much. It is really interesting and a pleasure to see that Congress is putting their attention on the marine transportation system, period.
Absolutely.
A little bit to follow on your question or your statement, Chris, about underinvesting in infrastructure. I want to go back to a question that was provided by our attendees. And it's related to the larger ships. I mean, a lot of people like to simplify the system by talking about larger ships and how larger ships can make the system more efficient. But relative to infrastructure capabilities, supply chain requirements, are these larger ships providing more flexibility or less flexibility? Are they making ports more resilient, the supply chain more resilient or less resilient? And I'm going to open this up to anybody.
I think Peter made an interesting comment about it. You know, I think from an operator standpoint, meaning an ocean carrier standpoint, to carry more cargo on the same conveyance, you're lowering your cost per unit carried. So certainly as an economic prospect, that's interesting. I'm not convinced that, you know, there was a total supply chain consideration in the scale up from, you know, I can remember back in the days when the U.S. lines ships were the biggest ships in the world, and they were 4,428 TEUs large. I'm not so sure how much consideration about the impacts to the supply chain went into what's happened over the last 30 years, where we now have ships that are capable of carrying 20,000 TEUs. So I think the jury's out on that.
Thank you. Kathy, would you like to respond, or Peter, or Darren?
I would. Let me sign up here. Am I on now?
Yes, sir, loud and clear.
Okay, let me just say, I think a big mistake, and I actually got this from some now former steamship line executives. I think they let the engineers decide how big the ship should be and how many containers they can hold, and with a single-minded focus on reducing the fuel cost per container, without any consideration of the impact on the importers, the export of the ports, of the marine terminals, the cranes, the containers, or the marketing department or operations. I don't know anybody who's with a steamship line who will tell you honestly, not for attribution, that these big ships have benefited the ocean carriers in any way. They make the carriers less nimble. They cannot move around. They've reduced competition. There are now effectively 3 ocean carriers out there. The fact that you have 4 ocean carriers on one ship, all leaving, think about it, leaving one terminal, the same terminal, at the same moment, going at the same pace to the same terminals over on the other side of the ocean. Where's the competition in that? Their load, their cutoffs, they're all the same. There's no competition. The only competition is really in customer service. That's all. But in the actual provision of the service, the transportation service, there's no competition anymore. There are carrier operating folks will tell you they'd much rather have the 8,000 or 12,000 TEU ship so they can divide up the cargo between various ports and various terminals. That you don't have the catastrophe, you have a number of terminals where a number of ports where one terminal is getting the big ship and that terminal is grossly overwhelmed with lines out the gates, delays and congestion. While right next door to it is a terminal that sits empty, sits vacant. Now you have the ports that are building new terminals and have a lot of acreage. They can adjust, they can build bigger terminals. They still have the problem of the rail lines getting overloaded when that big ship comes in. And you have other ports, such as Northwest Seaport Alliance, that are doing an excellent job in trying to merge adjoining terminals so you create a bigger footprint for one terminal and bringing bigger cranes, bigger capacity. And at Oakland, the same thing. But again, at our largest gateways, LA and Long Beach, significantly challenged. And how do you get these private terminals decide to merge so they can create a greater footprint? So frankly, I'd love Gene Soroka and John Wolf and Mario Cordero all to become operating ports, to be able to operate gates, to be able to merge terminals to create the size. But there is nobody who has benefited. No one has benefited, including the ocean carriers, in my view, by these massive ships. And it is now being demonstrated. CMA CGM is ordering new ships, and they're not ordering the 22,000 TEU ships. It was a mistake. It was a mistake when Sealand ordered the very fast ships. What was that, 25, 30 years ago? The SL7s or whatever that could set speed records across the Atlantic. They've never ordered those again. So sometimes people make mistakes.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter. Kathy?
Yeah, Helen, from a port perspective, a lot of what Peter says rings true, right? The number of loads discharged at one time increased exponentially almost overnight, right? I mean, if you look from 2014, when I started with the Port of Virginia, the average size vessel was 8,000 TEUs. We've got a 16,000 TEU ship calling next week, right? So it's doubled in that short amount of time, and you sort of had everything in between. Now, we were well positioned, again, because we sort of saw it on the horizon, and we implemented new technologies that could help with the fluidity of that freight. Some other ports were not in a position to do so. But if you just look at the Army Corps of Engineers, too, from a federal investment perspective, right? The amount of money that had to go into raising the Bayonne Bridge, deepening to 50 feet there, deepening to 50 feet in Jacksonville, our project going to 55 feet. Baltimore is now doing a second terminal to 50 feet just to accommodate these larger vessels. And so that's a significant amount of upfront investment that's cost shared with the non-federal sponsor, with the state, but then it's an ongoing O&M issue, an increase in needed federal funding on an ongoing basis to retain these depths and widths for these vessels. So, it's these long-term impacts. You can't just look at the short term. And then to Peter's point as well, then you've got the internal infrastructure on the rail side and those additional surges at one time. You've got to have availability of the rail cars and less congestion on the network in order to accommodate those freight flows. So it kind of goes back full circle to the first comment in looking at working with the regional transportation planning organizations, looking at where are there bottlenecks being caused on the land side outside the gate infrastructure, and a forecast of how that might continue as we continue to get these larger discharges, and on the export side as well, right? Because that's almost doubled too, the number of ships that were containers that we're loading out. So I think it's definitely something that's had a huge impact on ports and on the level of funding that we are seeking to do the upgrades to our facilities to keep pace.
Thank you. I'm going to take one last question, then I'm going to ask Admiral Timmy and Mr. Connor to provide some closing statements. Given the fact that we're having greater environmental impacts from hurricanes and other environmental activities, it is possible that a port or a region could be shut down. And obviously, when we have short shutdowns, we have them for because of hurricanes. But if something were longer, and this was something we thought about, especially after Hurricane Sandy and others. And the question is, if you shut one region down, I guess for any reason, how do you move cargo? And I think that we learned in many cases, it is the shippers who have the contingency plans and provide the alternatives. But the question has been asked on whether should there actually be a national freight routing in an emergency? And I think we have to bring Admiral Timmy into this, because often when there are closures, it is the captain of the port who makes the decisions for many things that goes on in that port, right? And Coast Guard in the region. So in the past, we've seen that it's the shippers who say, stay out of it. We're going to manage our own, because we have our own contingency plans. but would a national strategy for moving freight around or telling people where to go, so to speak, be of advantage? And Admiral Timmy, despite fallout on Coast Guard, what's your perspective?
I would argue we do have a process. Well, you mentioned the capital ports do have a process to move cargoes in the marine transportation recovery process.
Sir, you're breaking up. You're breaking up.
Recovery unit, MTS unit, midstream process. Now, as a matter of fact, up on our inland rivers as the I-40. You there? I'll yell louder. Hear me? Test.
Yes, sir, we can hear you.
So we
just
have a
sometimes
process
it
that
breaks
plays
up.
out pretty effectively, crisis, either on the rivers. Is it this one here? Oh, now. Better. Test.
Yes, sir.
Test.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, so Helen, it's a great question, right? It has to do with how we are going to facilitate in a post-crisis environment, and we do it pretty regularly at the port level. I would have to do some thinking on the value of nationalizing that. What I always tell people is I can give you consistency and a national policy, but you're going to lose the flexibility you want to deal with the local level. And if you've seen one port, you've seen one port. Right now, up in where the I-4 is shut down, you've stopped that waterway, and you have a queue. It's already been prioritized by the captain of the port and the MTSRU working with the locals. It's going to move, cargoes for the Department of Defense, followed by gasoline to the Nashville area to relieve that kind of crunch there. And then it gets to some other things that have been decided upon. I think that's been effective itself. And you're right, to your point. We let the market figure it out until we need to get involved. And then we do it really light touch, because I really only want to touch the things that I'm dealing that have to do with national security issues, or really responding to an emergency in there.
Okay,
but we're going to do it more and more often. We did it 8 times in the Gulf last year. All right.
Sir, I'm so sorry we're breaking up. I'm going to, if you have any, I don't know if you're, I'm going to, yeah, thank you. If you have any final closing statements, because when your time flies when you're having fun. And any closing remarks, if we can hear you?
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks again for including me in this. What a great group of panelists, learned a lot of things. I just want to reiterate what I said before. I think, a comment one of my friends one of these friends I've had for years and never really understood what I did and never really understood logistics or shipping. He said to me, Chris, shipping and ports have been in the news more than since Jackie Kennedy married Aristotle Onassis. And that's funny to think about, but it's because of the crisis, that's occurred. I think that this crisis playing out in real time now, as far as port congestion and supply chain disruption, is it's creating a moment in time where we can potentially get the kind of funding needed to set the course for a much improved maritime and freight network across this country for generations to come. So I'm excited about it. I think the ingredients are in place, and I look forward to being, part of that in the advocacy work that we do on behalf of the port industry. So thanks again for having me.
Thank you. And I can see we're still seeing the Admiral come in and out. So on his behalf, I'm going to say thank you so much from the CMTS. Thank you so much to the AAPA staff who really did help put this together with us, managing the application today and everything else. Thank you so much to our presenters. Really great conversation. We look forward to more in the future. Have a great National Infrastructure Week and talk to you real soon. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you for the
everyone.
opportunity.
Great stuff.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And guess what? I'm getting on now. I just was told to get on a video. Guess what?
What?
It's a group that's developing an inland port in the Central Valley of California. You know, everybody's working on this issue all the time.
There
Timing
you
is,
go.
Helen, thank you. Thank you, AAPA.
Pleasure.
Thank you,
Thank
sir.
you, guys.
Take
It was
care.
a
Thank
pleasure.
y'all.
Yeah, take care. Do we still have some of our organizers here?